Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session on strategies for global democratic U-turns. My name is Daniel Perez. I'm the director of the Kellogg Institute. Today, our distinguished guest is Jonathan Katz, who will join Professor Andres Mejia to discuss the Brookings Democracy Playbook, which addresses the rising threats to democracy and the rule of law globally. Jonathan Katz is a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and he's the co-editor of the Brookings Democracy Playbook 2025. He's an expert on democracy, the rule of law, anti-corruption, and international development. And he has held senior positions at the Department of State, USA, and Congress, including serving as National Security Advisor to Senator Amy Klobuchar. Katz previously led the democracy initiatives at the Sherman Marshall Fund, where his work focused on democratic resilience, free media, and governance reforms across Europe and Eurasia. To lead the conversation today, we have with us Andres Mejia Costa, who is the Custer Family Associate Dean for Policy and Practice at the Keough School. Andres has published extensively about political institutions and political economy, and his most recent publication in the current issue of the Journal of Democracy is in fact an article with Javier Pérez Sandoval about how populist leaders undermine the state, a topic that I suspect is going to be very relevant to the issue. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Notre Dame, Andres.
Thank you everyone for attending, but especially Jonathan for making the trip out here, braving the elements, flight cancellations and all that. To give you a little bit of a background, we had a conversation, Aniva, Jonathan, and I back in May last year when Brookings hosted a fantastic panel, closed door, on the prospects for democratic backsliding and U-turns. And we were very much discussing this, but one amazing thing that Brookings does systematically is to be a bridge between high quality research with policy influencing. So we wanted to maintain and continue this conversation and meet the other part of the policy conversation. And Jonathan wanted to see how, what the landscape here in an American university looks like in these times of rapid change. Jonathan, you co-edited the third edition of the Democracy Playbook with Ambassador Norm Eisen, and this was released a few days before the 2025 inauguration of the current administration. In your opening pages, you anticipated this would be a challenging 2025 year for democracy, and I suppose it hasn't been that eventful since. I wanted to start with a question, thinking about the comparative lens and the lessons from abroad to the current process of democracy in the US. When we were students here at the Kellogg Institute eons ago, we were very much learning and teaching and trying to adapt how the lessons about democratic institutions would travel or not to other settings in Latin America. I wrote my dissertation thinking about models of legislative coalitions and things like that, and whether they worked or not. And we now seem to be in an upside down setting where the Democratic Playbook and the talks about 7 pillars that the comparative global scholarship and practice of democracy promotion that must be perceived, how they must be taken care of. So my question is there a specific country study or study lesson that surprised you when you are developing this playbook and it had something to say, sort of anticipate or better help us understand what is happening in democracy in the US today?
Yeah. First of all, just wonderful to be here, and the timing is right to be in Notre Dame, even in the snow and in the cold, which seems to be blanketing much of the United States these days. To have this type of conversation, I think when I hear you speak as somebody who worked globally at USAID, State Department, we were often developing democracy programs for countries we were often looking across in our history at aid at what worked, what didn't work. And that was often country examples that we turned to help us develop the next set of programs, tools that we thought would work. But we weren't really looking inward at the United States. So I think that is where, that Democracy 2025 playbook, not the first playbook that I've been and co-writing and co-editing. In fact, it's the third edition. And each one of these editions comes, the first in 2019 was largely in response to an area that I worked in on and looked at while I was at USAID, which was democratic backsliding in Europe. And concerns about what was taking place in Hungary, in Poland at the time, Czech Republic, and concerns that we were seeing a wider trend of democratic backsliding globally, and maybe not as much attention being placed there. So in 2019, joined with others in writing and using sort of through research analysis, best practices, publishing this 2019 playbook. But in addition to publishing a playbook, we also launched something called the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which was a bipartisan group set up in Washington to address backsliding, recognizing and bringing in both practitioners and experts to come together to try to address a challenge that we were seeing, something that started in Europe, didn't start in Europe, but was happening, and how we would respond. It just so happened that that was the first term also of the Trump administration. And I think we slowly realized that there was a potential that some of the same lessons that we have seen, I saw 3 years of work, in decades of work, both in Congress, looking internationally, and then from USAID and State Department, could happen in the United States. The 2021 playbook that we co-authored, including and commitments to strengthen democratic resilience, was in reaction to the election of President Biden and the promise of the Summit for Democracy. For those of you who remember, this was really, in many ways, it was some of our recommendations that the US needed to step up its efforts globally to address democratic challenges. We saw challenges in the US, but really this was an outward-facing effort by the Biden administration. Whether you think it was successful or not, we can go into that discussion. But that period, we recognized, I think even more closely when looking at the US domestic landscape politically and the issues that were taking hold in polling numbers, that we saw that there was a real possibility that you might have a return Trump administration. And how would that start to impact US democracy? And then how would it have an impact globally? And so that 2025 playbook, building on this work previously, including with scholars from around the world, it's not just Brookings, although I want to give Brookings a lot of credit, but it was based on the good work of you and your colleagues and those around the world that have been writing, documenting, civil society organizations, practitioners, to build out a response to backsliding. How do you prevent it? How do you strengthen resilience within countries? But also, we were seeing some existential threats, including both China and Russia, and a global power changes that we knew would sort of really have an impact, including networks, autocratic networks that we were really growing and increasingly concerned amongst the circles that we've worked in. So we really set about, I think, in this 2025 playbook, to think about how do we address what we thought would be acute challenges in the US, but also still relevant lessons learned comparatively globally that we are bringing back with examples and sharing those. But also, and I think we, over the past year, unfortunately, what we were writing about, these threats, and we call them, right now we call them crack pillars in many ways, that I think our concerns were correct. We weren't the only ones speaking to these. We were also concerned that in and the United States in particular, that there wasn't attention being paid to what potentially could happen. And I think what we wrote about has come to fruition. But I think in the case here, when we're talking about the playbook, is not that it is a foregone conclusion that democracy backslides or that you can't prevent it. It's actually to provide those tools. And I think whether it's in the US and globally, particularly in 2025, there is also enormous, there's like many examples where democracy actors, civil society, protests from Nepal to Bangladesh, to what took place recently in South Korea, to elections in Senegal, you can see that there is a response to this autocratic surge, a democracy surge. So I think we tend to be optimistic, maybe sometimes to a fault, that there are tools available, and we're seeing them here in the United States too, to respond. And so we want to keep building on this work. In the past year, you asked me examples, I think great examples like Moldova and Moldovan democracy. And not a lot of people are focused on Moldova, a small country in Eastern Europe that I focused on, but their resilience, despite the fact of extraordinary amounts of interference in the election by Russia, recent elections, and internal challenges, proxies of Russia internally, Moldova has been able to stay on track and continue its democratic transformation and drive towards the European Union, despite a war on its border, despite the efforts of a country that has Russia, that has had impacted the internal political health of countries across that region. But we look at these examples about this in October, about the courage of political leaders like Maya Sandu, the president of Moldova, but more about the Moldovan people, because of their courage to choose a path and civil society in Moldova to continue to move in that direction, despite all the challenges, including the loss of US funding and support for Moldova's democracy, and seeing other partners of Moldova step up, including European countries, to provide critical support in addition to the strength of the Moldovan people. And I think this is, to us, is inspiring. It's one story of many. And in our playbook, I think we're sharing the lessons of those that have been successful, but also those that have failed in responding. And I think we all have a lot to learn in this space, particularly Americans who were at the front edge of that, sort of pushing this globally. And now we see a scramble for Americans across the country asking about global examples. How did they do it in Poland? How were they able to respond to a more autocratic tilt? How were they able to respond in Brazil? And so we can certainly get into that, but I think it's an important time and an opportunity to kind of rewrite these scripts and to take the positive and really put it to use.
Certainly, and one of the elements in the Moldovan case and others, there was always this either a promise of, say, EU integration, or a promise of the importance of an international rules-based order that would preserve some broader global values, like the Inter-American Democratic Charter. But in the context of the new national security strategy, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the recent operation in Venezuela, what would be the realistic scope for US-led democracy promotion today? Both in terms of sort of international credibility, international stance, but also in terms of the domestic governance gap that we were talking about, how democracy promotion agencies in the US have been undermined in their capacity to achieve those goals.
Yeah, no doubt that, and the US has been the largest provider of democracy assistance globally for many years. And so the US under President Trump has chosen to take assistance in a different direction. And certainly this has an impact. The assistance has an impact. The loss of assistance certainly has an impact for NGOs, for those who are in countries where there are concerns about human rights violations or the potential for human rights violations. I think in the case of Venezuela, too, you could sort of see this gap between an administration that has really gotten rid of the key experts who know how to engage globally in the democracy space, the mechanisms within the US government, so you can fund, surge funding if you needed to surge funding, like when we were in Ukraine after the Maidan in 2013, 2014, the US was able to step in with a government facing economic challenges, but also facing extraordinary pressure from Russia still, and able to surge support. So if you wanted to in Venezuela, the decision, and let's not get into the legality of that's another question that has to be addressed. But the idea that if you had an election in 2024, that by all counts, and I'm talking to colleagues over at the Carter Center, looking at their statements about that election, that the opposition won. So you had, I don't really buy this idea that, I think it was pretty clear, at least based on what has been reported about these numbers. But if the United States wanted to provide support to try to really seek that democratic transformation, that it may not have the capacities to do so, let alone whether or not the President of the United States is really interested in democracy or oil. That's a different, sort of a different conversation. But I think for the US, certainly there's been a significant loss in expert capacity to do this work. I think there's a lot of good people who are looking back at 7 decades and are trying to capture that information externally to make sure that we capture what's worked, what hasn't worked. It's treasure trove of information on development, not only in the democracy space, but spanning to global health, humanitarian assistance, really critical areas. And then you also have the impact of diplomacy. The development piece has to be married with diplomacy and strategy when you're in the US government. And of course, I think the decimation of certain parts of the State Department that worked on these issues as well, the loss of senior officials from the State Department and key bodies has an impact. You may question whether you agree or disagree with policy. If you don't have the right people leading your policies or planning, you're more likely to get them wrong than right. And I think it was not only in Venezuela, but the horrific humanitarian situation in Iran, where thousands were killed, and you had members of Congress calling for the U.S. to be able to provide information to crack an internet blackout, and Iranian government didn't want Iranians to be able to engage globally. And the U.S. has capacities to help citizens, civil society globally break down those barriers so they're able to communicate. And you had members of Congress pushing for this, pushing for U.S. global broadcasting. That was significant. So you have lost capacity, loss of diplomacy, and it doesn't seem to be a strategy in this space. I think some bright lights are that you do have members of Congress very much interested in democracy support. We have the annual appropriations process. I won't bore you into the details, but Congress, even though it's a cut to the overall funding, Republicans and Democrats in significant numbers in the House, which tends to be a little bit more political at times than the Senate, voted strongly in favor of funding assistance, including democracy assistance, Venezuela, for Iran, and then also for organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, including 81 Republicans voting to defeat an amendment to cut all funding for NED. And you can see in the statements of these members I know specific to Republicans, saying we value this work, this democracy space. We're concerned about propaganda globally. We're concerned about the United States stepping back and ceding space to adversaries. So I don't think the story is yet written about how the U.S. is going to engage. Even if Congress passes this funding, I'm not sure that the administration will spend the funding in the way that Congress wants it to. That's a different subject matter of separation of checks and balances and separation of powers. But I think it's really important to know that sort of U.S. engagement globally has had an impact. And of course, as the U.S. steps back, what you really want to see, and which we've encouraged, is to see other donors come in, countries, private sector, foundations, and in some cases they have. Good example is Moldova, support for Moldovans before the election period. But in many cases, countries, including in Europe, have had to shift their funding to increased levels of defense and security based on U.S. policy. We can talk about that, but hopefully that gives you an example. And I think, unfortunately, the multilateral space, based on sort of recent withdrawal from several multilateral bodies, including at the UN, sent a signal about the intention and support of engagement in multilateral bodies, and so certainly the U.S. disengagement leaves those bodies open to others to set the agenda, good and bad.
But certainly the example of congressional representatives investing and protecting the appropriation process, it's a good sign of green shoots emerging from the ice around.
I think it's a little bit buyer's remorse.
Yeah.
And I think from others and sort of the analysis and work we're doing too, when you not only in Venezuela, Iran, but also this issue of Greenland with an ally and a partner, has raised the questions about whether the policy is going in the right direction. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the policy on Iran is wrong or right, but so the questioning, what are U.S. interests, and for members of Congress, having worked on Congress and worked closely with both Republicans and Democrats, there has been strong support for decades for U.S. assistance funding globally and for democracy support globally, and so overwhelming support. And we see that even in polling numbers, American public, there is strong support for U.S. engagement globally, including support, whether it's humanitarian assistance or democracy support. And some of these issues might differ between Republicans and Democrats when you look at polling, but there is support for engagement, and there is an interest in how the U.S. is perceived, but also U.S. values and how that extends globally.
Yeah. A quick reminder to our online audiences, you have the ability to type in comments, questions, and they will be read during the Q&A. I will ask one more question, and then I'd like to open it to students and faculty present to ask any questions. Jonathan, when discussing the engagement strategies, the Democracy Playbook, and then a follow-up article that you discussed with Rachel and Renee, some of your colleagues, are thinking about the challenges for higher education in the democracy promotion space. What would you say is the most impactful way for students enrolled in U.S. universities to navigate today's partisan divisions and defend democratic values? And add on, how can faculty better engage in this research translation aspect to move the research work they produce into informing policy and practice?
Yeah, we did, when we wrote this piece too, I think we started off by talking about the incredible value to the United States of higher education. Just want to remind, how important it is, and to both research, and we won't get into the type of research, including medical and others that are absolutely critical But we started off talking about this value to both the U.S. in terms of research, developing the next set of leaders in the United States are coming through, through Notre Dame, but also across the country. The role that higher education and universities play in the communities where they are. This is not a nice to have, it's a must have in communities. The contribution, and then also, certainly the engagement on key issues like democracy that is so important. And I think, I'm not sure if you know too, I mean, one of the reasons we, even over the last year, has been we talked a little bit about strengthening the relationship between think tanks and also academic institutions across the country, higher education, but also thinking about ways in which universities could play a more significant role in engaging the public itself. And this was born out of a conversation with colleagues over at Harvard about civic education for the public, opening the doors of universities, colleges to the public, and really finding a way to have these centers not be ivory towers, in our case, Washington, the Beltway, inside the Beltway bubbles, but also really engaging externally. And I think for students, clearly there's so many paths to go down, whether it's volunteering, whether it's engaging in campaigns, engaging in local communities, civil society organizations, and finding sort of a path to work locally. Even as you guys, I know many of you are sort of globally thinking, but really thinking about how you can engage at the local level is really critically important right now. Voting, I don't think this is a group that needs a push on voting, but we had over 80 million Americans who did not vote, and in the last election, for all various reasons. We can go into that. There's plenty of analysis on that. But playing a role to convince the publics in the public community that you're surrounded with, families, to have these conversations about engaging. And so I think it's quite personal for students. For universities, I think Notre Dame is doing an extraordinary job. You are at bringing scholarship, research, and we mentioned, how do we bring that to policymakers across the country? Not only at the federal level, I think Brookings, I might get dinged for this, spends an awful lot of time focused on Washington, and maybe less time focused on where there's extraordinary synergy, both democracy and sort of reimagining and renewal, which I think our conference also touched on renewal at the state and local levels. And I think when we talk a little bit about our next democracy playbook, subnational engagement in the United States is absolutely critical. And then I would also, is that those that are focused globally and especially experts that are here, professors and others, is to share the experience and lessons learned from countries with Americans. And I will tell you, there's an absolute strong desire and appetite to understand what has worked globally, to apply it in the United States. And I think this is a great opportunity to share that information engagement. We have done this on our end through a number of democracy roundtables that we've hosted, in Washington with experts globally. And we've been asked by local CSOs in states across the US to please connect us, organize events to bring this expertise to us. I think Americans have a lot to learn. And I think there's an open door to listen and to engage.
Fantastic, thank you. And with that charge, I will open that a space for conversation with the community here. I would ask you to briefly introduce yourselves and be precise on your questions. Anybody here and online, of course, we have monitoring the questions. Yes, please.
Oh, hi. My name is Nicole. I'm a current senior here, majoring in marketing and political science. In a lot of my classes, we talk about the role AI is going to play in democracy. It's obviously changed the way we consume information by making it more accessible, but it's also led to spreading of false information. In your view, how big of a threat do you think AI poses to democracy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI to actually strengthen democracy, but also clearly has there's two sides to this, and into the use of AI, strengthening, for example, engagement of the public in democracy on issues, engagement directly with elected representatives. There's an opportunity, particularly for election management, for AI to strengthen systems. That is certainly the case. And we wrote about this about 2 years ago, trying to really, at Brookings, with several colleagues, to break down what we think can be the positive side of AI. And of course, the threats that you talked about, whether it's deep fakes. We've seen in elections globally where this has had an impact. At times, hard to measure the exact impact of a deep fake or disinformation. In a recent election in Slovakia, which was relatively close, you had a situation where you had a deep fake, had advertisement right before the election. Did that sway the outcome of the election or not? Hard to measure, but obviously damaging. And we've had it in the United States as well. And of course, I think we all can see that the capacities of AI, even as we have the next level of chat GPT, and also the capacities is pretty significant, but it's impacting so many different spaces. So the question is, how do we, as a public respond? How do state election management bodies respond to these potential threats? In the 2024 election, I'll just give an example. The Secretary of State of Arizona, who we hosted a couple weeks right before the 2025 elections and before the 2024 elections, had set up a tiger team of both tech companies, think tanks, and at the time working directly with what was then DHS, Department DHS, that deals with cyber intrusions and also foreign interference, which by the way has been gutted. We'll talk about it, which makes this topic more disconcerting, and I'll sort of explain. And it was a very good example of can you harness AI for positive, and how do you defend against the worst of that? And they were very successful at educating the public and also setting up what would be almost like a hotline to deal with deep fakes and how that would impact the election. It could be anything like, the election has been moved to another day, or your polling place has been sorry, you're no longer going to vote there. You're going to have to vote somewhere else. Sort of trying to address these challenges, but in real time. And I thought it was incredibly successful in 2024, which election experts and observers, pointed to these things as this is a model to respond. Fast forward to 2025, that funding, the federal funding to strengthen and protect elections in the US, including from foreign interference, the funding for that has been gutted. And so that the state of Arizona, their Secretary of State, no longer has that type of cooperation, directly with with the federal government to respond to these types of threats. So there's positive pieces to what AI can do and negative, but the other part is if elections aren't protected, then it opens the space. If there isn't the capacity to respond, then you're really in a difficult position. You'll see those impacts ramp up, and obviously the speed of both AI and how it's used and how cost effective it is. Yeah, it makes it a tool. By the way, disinformation and negative campaigning have been around forever. I ran political campaigns when I first started. I know, but the speed, capacity to do this is coupled with efforts to, some people call it election suppression. Some people say it's making sure people shouldn't be voting, don't vote. We can talk about elections. In our playbook, we talk, our number one pillar to protect is elections. And in our playbook, our next one that we'll be writing, the number one key point of contestation in Democratic U-turns, we can have a debate, others here I'm sure will, is you have to have elections. You have to have performance at the polls, but it has to be pretty fair and transparent. If you do not have that, how are you going to have a U-turn? How are you going to pivot from, and it doesn't guarantee if you have an election win, like in Venezuela or in Belarus, even if you win, that you're going to have that U-turn. So we're really hyper-focused on this issue, but I think you raise a really important issue within not only the context of elections, but policy in general, and how are policies working to benefit the public. And so we can talk about everything from, sort of our bills, like how people are going to be paying, there are real pocketbook issues for, including the United States, for AI and AI boom. That's political as well.
Thank you. Fernando, and then Eric.
Hi, I'm Fernando. I'm a guest scholar here at the Kellogg Institute. Thank you for this. I was reading the playbook, and I saw that you identified the judicial capture as a risk for democracy. So I want to ask you, how do you see it right now in the US? And if you have seen some mechanisms that they have used to actually capture or to threat the judicial independence?
Yeah. There are certainly efforts to try to capture the judiciary, but it's been one of the guardrails that is held up to some extent. And you can see this in courts across the country, rulings that sometimes favor the administration, sometimes don't, and everything from the deployment of whether it be National Guard or ICE agents to cities like Chicago, and then you also, sort of have, I think with this, looking at the judiciary in the US and the health of it, obviously at the state and national level, you realize that as a guardrail itself, it can't necessarily slow down, and this is the US specifically, all actions that you might think are anti-democratic or you perceive as backsliding. It's not a silver bullet or magic bullet to solve all these challenges and problems. And so I think we're talking about maintaining that. You need that rule of law to be protected. Absolutely. There's no doubt. And I think there's no real precedent in terms of the level of litigation and engagement across the judiciary in the United States like we're seeing right now. It certainly takes a toll. I think the disconcerting piece of this for those that are watching, when we say protect the judiciary, also means protect the physical, judiciary. Judges that are being threatened physically, and because of the potential for political violence, there's an absolute concern about not only physical violence, but the threat of harassment and intimidation. I don't care on what spectrum this is, but often we certainly focus on sort of significant and unfortunately horrific events like in Minnesota, Charlie Kirk, what we saw yesterday in Minnesota with the Congresswoman, but the amount of harassment and facing judges in the United States is extraordinary. It's not often included when we talk about political violence, but we do in our, when we talked about this in August, wrote about the need to protect judges, election workers, and those that are carrying out critical work. So yeah, so there's different pieces of this. One is whether that guardrail is holding as a sort of check and balance, across the country at the state and sort of federal levels. And then there's the state of how we're engaging with the judiciary and how do you protect them. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Hi, Mr. Katz. I'm Gerald. I'm currently a junior studying economics and political science. I like how you talked about how democracy can be seen from a comparative lens. So following from that, what do you, in your opinion, what's the sources of democratic backsliding or the most common sources of democratic backsliding? So I would like to just know whether there are institutions that are perhaps more susceptible to manipulation or democratic backsliding.
Yeah, I think a lot about corruption and political leadership, and corruption in particular, because it sort of undergirds a lot of what you see in terms of backsliding and how actors in political systems seek to gain control. And in the U.S. right now, one would argue at this moment that there's a rising concern about levels of what would be state capture or government corruption. And we won't go into all these, all sort of the cases that we see, but why we think this is because we can see the guardrails internally, including in the Department of Justice. For example, we see the removal or the weakening of the internal guardrails, inspector generals, departments and agencies. We see no ethics pledge in the White House. Where I work for my colleague at Brookings was the ethics czar for Barack Obama. Everybody who worked in the administration, politicals had to sign sort of this pledge, and it was reviewed. And there was, Norm likes to say, my colleague normalizing that there was no corruption like that. Like they were watching. There was mechanisms internally to watch what was happening, but clearly those guardrails aren't the same now as they were previously. So how do you, so we're seeing, you asked, I think that cause, I'm going to only point to it. There's a lot that we can point to, but it is corruption itself too, that really sort of undergirds what we're seeing in terms of backsliding, or is a key focal point. So that's why in the playbook, we focus on this as this is also one of our pillars. And it's because there are mechanisms to address this challenge, but if you start removing the guardrails, and right now, unfortunately, when you look at what's happening in the administration, they've removed them. And that means that the offices that work on investigating fraud, waste, and abuse aren't doing that right now. And then when you have Congresses that's unwilling to, through hearings or other mechanisms, hold the executive branch accountable for potential corruption, then who's holding them accountable? Who does the investigation? If nobody at the FBI is going to investigate, or Department of Justice, because they have political loyalty to the administration, which is something I think this president was very interested, differing from his first term to his second. But we see the same issue globally in countries where you have, and there's a lot more where there's similarities, but I think of corruption. I've spent the last several years, including through our project at Brookings, the Anti-Corruption Democracy and Security Project, focused on how do you address this challenge and how
devastating it is in countries. Not only is state capture sort of enriching these bad actors, but it has an enormous impact, I think, in Venezuela on populations when that money does not go to the people. And it makes my blood curl when I see the mechanism that has been set up, particularly in Venezuela, on this oil transfer and external accounts being set up where this money is going without oversight. There is little to no oversight. And I think you saw members of Congress today asking questions about the Venezuela policy because they have no insight. They can't see what the administration's doing with this money. That's only one example, but it set up an alarm bell. Like everybody in the anti-corruption community is working on these issues, financial transparency and integrity, are saying transparency and accountability is really critical to good governance and to democracies. If you don't have it, it's very difficult to have a functioning democracy that serves the people versus those that are seeking self-enrichment.
Thank you. Please, and then possibly. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Spencer. I'm a senior. I study political science and history. I had a question about the military. It remains one of the highest, most trusted institutions in the country, but seems like over the past year, it's been drawn into more and more partisan fights. Does it play in democratic backsliding?
Yeah, certainly the U.S. military is a significant institution. I think in the playbook, we really urge the military to be careful about not obeying undemocratic orders. And I think there's certainly concerns about civilian military relations and how, for example, the National Guard is being used. And we work with colleagues and have hosted, I think, several roundtables on this issue because we're concerned about how that might play out and how problematic that might be. From my perspective, I'm a little bit more concerned about federal law enforcement and how they're being used. Now, I think immigration is a real issue, but the approach to it, and how you engage and carry out a policy, well, that's a different story. So, and I think in particular, concerns about ICE and how ICE is being used in the community that's focused on elections, that often comes up. Like, what's going to happen in the midterm elections this year? And our advice is that that the United States has a tradition of free, fair, and transparent elections. States know how to handle that. They're election workers. They're your next door neighbors. They're people in your community. They don't need, you don't need the federal government to intrude on elections that are run by states. And some would say it's executive overreach, it's illegal. And so this is a really big issue to tackle, but even in the playbook, we do our best to try to lay out a strategy which kind of removes the political and maintains that civilian military distance. And I hope the administration is thinking about that if it wants to reduce tensions, which it says it does. It can start by thinking about how it's deploying, whether it's federal officers, by the way, who've been doing this work. This isn't new. ICE or previous incarnations of this have been working on these issues before. It's the policy, the approach, the communication. And so I think there's plenty of things that can be done to lower the tensions and then sort of get at challenging policy questions that don't involve creating fear or the perspective of violence. And I'll end there. It's a really difficult issue right now.
And critical. We have 2 questions online.
Yes. Would you like both questions at the same time?
Yeah.
Okay, and these are coming from Andres. How would you prioritize a number of problems of American democracy have laid bare by the current administration but have at its core the failure of Western democracies to adapt to the adverse effects of globalization and the digital revolution? Second question.
That's an easy one.
What elements of our democratic system would you like to see addressed, and in what order? Social media algorithms that emphasize agreement and limitation of social media, exposure of minors. 2, limitation of the influence of money in our democracy. 3, gerrymandering and mandating open primaries. 4, reform of the Electoral College. 5, mandating a year of service. And 6, term limits for Supreme Court justices and more equal distribution of election cycles between administrations.
I'm taking all these ideas. Yeah, that is the next playbook, and these are all a lot of great ideas. Having, again, I'll go back to the corruption issue. Is political corruption is area that we have focused on both in the playbook but in the work at Brookings and the Anti-Corruption Democracy and Security Project. I'm not going to put necessarily one above the other, but I think if I had a magic wand addressing the issue or the really the cancer of money in politics, even having worked as a congressional staffer, as having somebody who's had to raise funding politically. But how this has sort of grown in the US, the money that is not seen, the amount of money, and the impact on how for elected representatives, executive branch right now, but it's not just right now. To me, it would be addressing money in politics. And I think there's plenty of great solutions that have been offered. There is a challenge in that how the Supreme Court has ruled that has opened the floodgate of funding in US federal campaigns, and something that we absolutely need to address. And so it's always on our top of our list of thinking through with colleagues, is that money and politics issue? But if you go back through your list again, and I don't recall everything, they're all, well, because they do raise issues like term limits, which come up a great deal. One of the other ideas too is to do away with presidential pardons, or to severely restrict the limit, because you shouldn't be able to sort of buy your way into a pardon. That's not what that was meant to be. And of course, some of the changes that were suggested and others have recommended could include constitutional amendments, which are extraordinarily difficult to accomplish. And so I think going at these issues is critically important. Can you reread the first question again?
Get it back up here.
Sorry.
It's okay. How would you prioritize a number of problems of an American democracy being laid bare by the current administration, but have at its core the failure of Western democracies to adapt to the adverse effects of globalization and the digital revolution?
In the God, I'm going to sound like Brooke, right? In the playbook, our last pillar that we focused on was policies at work for the public, and I think we're really certainly globalization, inequality, economy. These are really we see. Looking at sort of voting data over multiple decades. We can start with Reagan administration. We've seen these shifts of whether it's independence, or middle class. You're seeing these shifts back and forth, almost searching for a leader or government that addresses whether it's income inequality, or we're talking about, today we use the word affordability, these issues that really make it difficult for many Americans to live the lives that they would like to live. And it's a real issue. It was the kind of issues I heard from voters in Pennsylvania right before the 2024 election, where they, if you were talking about Biden's economic success, they didn't buy it. They didn't feel it. But it was maybe those same group of voters that voted 4 years earlier for Joe Biden at this time wouldn't vote for Harris. There could be a number of reasons why they made that decision. And you can see that jump to Trump's first election win, to Obama and George W. Bush. You see a similarity in these voters and these voting patterns. So we haven't talked about Democratic U-turns and sort of completely, but we know, I think one of the areas that we think is critical in these points of contestation to get right is policies. And when we think about U-turns, we think about day one, which is right now. Think of it like in cycles. In order to obtain a U-turn, what are the things that you're going to have to do in order to get to a point where you have an opportunity? Maybe like in Venezuela. What did the opposition do? Maybe they did everything right, and except they've lived in an autocracy that be very difficult to remove that power. That makes it really difficult to do it. And the area that we identified, and I think it was challenging, is these policy spaces. How do you, in a contested, backsliding country, address the things that you need to get to the U-turn, right? To just get there. Free and fair elections, rule of law, try to combat corruption, keep open civic space. And then when you're getting into that transition moment, say in the United States, it was 2028 to 2029, whatever, who the Republican or Democrat. What are the policies that you are going to put in place to address what was just basically asked, like, don't you see that these problems keep coming up in democracies, this inequality, affordability, and how are you going to address that, really address it? And then how are you going to sustain those policies? Because we want to have sustainable interests in maintaining democracies, but we also know that economic issues drive much of how voters are thinking and how they vote. But it's also because it's the policy to address the challenge right now, or one of the challenges. So AI is a piece of that. The inequality piece will be, or inequality policies to address those, they need to be part of long-term solutions. So we're in our next playbook, we're going to be reaching out to all of you to come up with those strategies and the policies that work. And you need to have some sort of a sustainable coalition past the point of just an election in order to maintain that U-turn. And I will say that when you have an oscillation between democracies and those that are seeking to take in the other direction, it's very hard to implement and sustain policies. I just remember thinking during the Obama administration, when they passed the Obamacare, that the president needed at least 8 years to really get that policy that didn't work at the beginning to make it work and and to give it a chance. And today it's, while not perfect, is when you look at polling numbers and data, you can see that Americans don't want that taken away. That's part of the affordability issue right now. Or if as the president says, if he's got a better plan, then offer that up, because otherwise you're not addressing the issue. So I don't know if that addressed that point, but I think it's one of the more difficult ones for democracy actors to understand that you need these other pieces in order for the democracy U-turn to happen and to be sustained. You need policies, and that is sometimes is in the hands of brilliant scholars, including colleagues that I work with at Brookings, have some of these ideas of what we should be doing.
Of course. And then we have, of course, the issue of how democracy protects those guarantees and those policies over time.
Yep.
We have Andrew and Josefina.
Yeah, my question was regarding, I think it's the fourth pillar. You talk about the media. Obviously, it's key in democracies, but currently traditional media sources are in a very precarious situation, both as a result of the current political environment and long-term trends. How do you think we as a society should be thinking about these issues and trying to go about solving them?
Well, I think standing, one, you absolutely need independent media, no coercion of media because you don't agree with what's being written. I think a fair assessment of local media is really important. News deserts, particularly problematic in communities. More often than not, if you don't have local media, then who's filling that gap of information? And of course, by demographics and age, looking at media consumption, you get a pretty good sense of where people are consuming information from. So algorithms were mentioned. How do you address that challenge? Social media, for children, teens. I know the Canadians are thinking about how to approach that issue. I think they should certainly be on the table and how we're approaching these challenges. I think it's disappointing that the U.S. is not engaged globally in responding to the type of disinformation and misinformation that we see globally. And so that to me is important, that you not only are tackling that, in the US, but you're tackling that externally, but also you need misinformation coming into the United States from foreign actors. It's not determinative of the elections necessarily, but you also, when you have proxies within the United States willing to actually carry out that disinformation for a foreign adversary, and then there's little to no accountability for what took place, that's problematic. And by the way, it is not only the news outlets that are under pressure from the administration, or maybe their supporters. Of course, people can sort of disagree, but it's also the researchers and those that are working on identifying disinformation and misinformation and responding, that have been targeted, whether it's by Congress or by the executive branch, and that really is problematic because there's a chilling effect on, and I would say the same thing for universities too. We talked a little bit about that. So goal here is not to have administrations using the Department of Justice or other mechanisms, FCC, to go after those that maybe have a different perspective, point of view, or maybe are critical of the administration. I think the president, I'm not saying that the administration, they have a website where they kind of pick on the White House website, sort of looking at the worst actors of the day who are promoting mis or disinformation. And so I think it's quite problematic that the executive branch is playing that role. It's reminiscent of what we have seen in other countries globally and how they go after anybody who doesn't sort of toe a particular line. So we've got to address that. We've got to protect against that. The U.S. government in the past has done a lot of work globally, protecting journalists, providing resources to address SLAPP lawsuits, using a diplomatic voice to protest when journalists have been attacked or jailed, and so the U.S. is no longer doing that. Is a real loss globally. But I often find that the actions globally mirror the domestic actions being taken. They're kind of they're the precursors of one or the other, or give you a sense of where where the administration is coming from.
And even when you have disinformation campaigns, they still happen through US-based platforms.
Yeah.
So there seems to be an ecosystem at work. We have Josefina who's been patiently waiting as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for your conversation and for this format that is also so easy to follow. I am almost a senior citizen by now, but I'm a professor of the practice here with the Brookings Institute. I direct a project that is called the Peace Accords Matrix, and we monitor the implementation of peace accords around the world. So I resonate very, very, very well with your ideas about how do we produce research that is useful for policymakers. And some of the strategies that have worked for us in the last year is working with senators and even representatives. So Republican Representative Young wrote to Marco Rubio saying, you have to reinstate funding for the Mindanao monitoring process in the Philippines. So I very much agree with that strategy. And obviously also with the idea that the political system has become anti-democratic in the sense that we have an executive that has great powers. We have the display. I think that for me, what has been the most traumatic scene, the scenes from Minneapolis, is the display of direct violence by special forces, which of course reminds me of Civil War situations, which I never thought would happen in the US against populations that were not racialized populations or immigrant populations. But it seems to me that we're still very much focused on the political system being anti-democratic. I am more concerned about democratic votes. So those that actually go to the polls, those that support anti-democratic government in a democratic way. So it's the anti-democratic values. When we think about, you were talking before about public ethics, right? And to have a president that glows at the side of an airplane that he's received as a gift. So it's, of course, he's a corrupt politician in that sense. But what worries me is not so much the corrupt politicians, but the sentiment and the democratic practice of choosing anti-democratic leaders, which is us, the population. So it's the sentiment, it's the values, but it's also the votes that said we don't want democracy. Not the system that is rigged, you know what I mean? So what do you
Or
think?
those that might feel comfortable with like strong rule or authoritarian rule.
And happy about it and engage in voting them into power. So it's not that they lie to us, but it's like, elect me and I will close down democratic spaces.
Yeah.
Can I compliment? Because we are from Latin America. I'm from Argentina. We voted for Milei. I mean, Argentinian people voted for.
Yeah.
And there is this. You mentioned as the main sources for backsliding two: corruption and political leadership.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about corruption a lot. I would like you, if you can develop more about political leadership and what happened in these cases when the leader is using democratic means to as Korea did in Ecuador, or I mean to validate authoritarian rule.
And people will still value that.
And people prefer that.
Yeah. I think maybe in the US, I don't think that
I'm in the Latin corner of I'm from Venezuela, so these issues are very close to my own experience. And I mean, we lived the erosion of our political system since, I mean, when we on the 90s. So sometimes we used to think that these non-democratic leaders are the cause of the problems, but they are not the cause. They are a consequence of many problems that are happening on society and why people feel represented on that proposal, political proposal. And one thing that I've been seeing regarding political democratic backsliding in other countries is that not all non-democratic leaders are the same. Some of them has different autocratic nature or ambitions. So they are not, some of them you can use institutional resilience mechanism that you still have in the country. But sometimes all those mechanisms, they don't exist, and happens Venezuela. I mean, what we went through. So I think it's very complex. And what happens with society is that they get like overwhelmed with this kind of things, like what happened in Minneapolis and what's happening with ICE, because actually is very, very overwhelming and bad. But you still have institutions, and you cannot lose that the United States has institutions, and you have to go there and use those mechanisms to avoid that this kind of politics move forward and go over, because you still have it. And I think that that's important.
That's that for a question.
Someone, yes, I think you're right that the phenomenon of autocratic leaders, there's a lot of factors that lead up to, election like we had in 2016, and then into 2024, sort of Trump 1, Trump 2, I maybe did not do it in an articulate way, is the recognition that there's been failures that leads to maybe the disillusionment by some, and whether they think that the system works for them. And in the case, and that somebody like Trump maybe can actually be the one to address their challenges, or it's a different version of Bill Clinton's "I feel your pain," but like in 2024. And I'm gonna give you resonance too. But there was also 80 million Americans who are not voting. Okay, because they don't, either thinking that for a number of reasons why they don't. We could break that down. So I agree that to ignore how you got to this moment, like what were the reasons, is likely to lead possibly again to that maybe a ping pong of, at least in the United States, that we see is, there's enough voter dissatisfaction and support, including for President Trump, on one end, to continue to, see this type of clash. So how are we thinking about, even in the playbook, trying to figure out how to try to address some of those challenges, those issues, those policies that whether it's making like people are thinking democracy doesn't work. So we're really trying to take the playbook down to the studs to try to address some of these issues, to see if we can address those challenges and sustain that enough or long enough to even move forward on democracy, can be mutually can reinforce important for the changes that are being made. But I think it's really an important point that you made, and I think we're quite aware. And I think when we do comparative and we look at autocrats, there's certainly a difference between autocrats. I mean, there are different labels, competitive authoritarians. There's certainly a difference between President Trump and a Vladimir Putin, no doubt. That's the case. But I think if we ignore what you are saying, it's likely that we'll continue to be in this flux politically, at least in the United States. This is sort of our assessment.
Wonderful. We have time for one more question. Please, briefly.
Thank you. Alexander Kustov, I'm a professor here at Q School of Global Affairs. So I'm curious, I'm gonna shift the gears a little bit. I'm curious about what didn't make it to the playbook, right? Because we talked about like term limits, for instance, right? It seems like a sensible idea, right? But if you talk to political scientists, everyone would tell you that it doesn't work, it's bad and things like that. So I'm wondering if you considered certain things that might have made it to the playbook but didn't for some reason. Also, thinking of like primary elections, also seems like a small d democratic idea. But then if you look at a lot of liberal democracies in Europe, they don't have it. Candidate selection is happening, by parties, and it seems to be working even better. So like, I'm curious if you.
And won't be, some of those examples where, where it works and where it may be an example of, to turn to, of course, in the United States, I think there's a number of movements in states to experiment. And, it's a good point whether or not you want to include those. We'll be doing a number of case studies in these points of contestation. And I think we're looking. We're trying to better understand.
Yeah, but were there something that you didn't want to include that people wanted you to include, but you're just like, no? To experiment.
I'm not going to say.
It was a democratic playbook.
But I think you're also constrained by, I would just talk about a physical constraint and how you're presenting a playbook when you're trying to, I think this is even more on the research, capacities, even for Brookings and for our team. I think we covered a significant amount of this landscape, but clearly we know it's not comprehensive, but it's meant to, I think, touch on, the what we thought were more prominent pillars to protect. So, and we welcome any additions to that, but I take your point.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for stepping.
Thank you.
I'm going. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.